This is a story about a car that we always knew was a good idea, but never thought they'd actually make it. You see, the Mazda CX-8 was originally intended to be a diesel only, but more than a year and a half into its model life, and earlier this year, they added the same 2.5 litre petrol from the CX-5 across the range to create a cheaper option. At the bottom end of the range, this means a proper 7-seat SUV with pricing that starts under the magical $40,000 barrier. It may not be all-wheel drive, but it brings those extra 2 seats and a whole lot more room for just a teeny bit more than the equivalent CX-5, and it's also $6,000 cheaper than the cheapest CX-9. Given that Mazda prices have tended to go up rather than down in recent times, this seems like a bit of a steal. And so to see just how much sense this makes, my growing family and I have spent the past 6 months and 5,000 kilometres on board the new petrol version of the CX-8 Sport. Given we've already lived with the CX-5 and CX-9, we've got a fair idea of what to look out for, not to mention our other long-term experiences with the Tiguan, Escape, CR-V, Golf R-Wagon, Santa Fe, Carnival and Stinger over the past 3.5 years. And as always, if you're looking for more detail, you can read my full review on the CarsGuide site, plus plenty of other CX-8 stories. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit like and subscribe to stay on top of all our latest videos. But for now, let's head to the back. The CX-8's overall length is actually a fair bit shorter than the CX-9, but the CX-8's boot area is only 60mm shorter, which suggests that most of the CX-9's extra length is in its nose, which isn't much use to anybody. The CX-8 also has the same distance between the rear wheel arches as the CX-9, and so while it might be slightly smaller in overall litre measurements, the usable area is pretty much the same. It also has the sliding second row seat, so you can prioritise boot space or back seat space depending on what you need. There's also decent underfloor storage, and a space saver spare helps to make more room under there, but it is interesting to note that there's no cargo cover. I must say I haven't once wished for the power tailgate that comes with the more expensive CX-8 GT and Asaki. Yes, it would be handy when approaching with your hands full, but I must say the traditional manual operation is so much quicker. Bottom line, the CX-8 is still a big boot, and check out how much we've managed to cram back here with the third row folded flat for a weekend family trip. Moving forward to the second row of seats, the CX-8's back doors actually open much wider than the CX-9's to a full 80 degrees, which is actually really handy when you're loading and unloading children. According to my measurements, the CX-8 is 100mm narrower between the doors than the CX-9, which meant that when it came to fitting my third child seat a few months ago, it just fit in, using the ISOFIX mounts in the outboard positions and the top tether in the middle. Now, your seats might actually fit better, but it's very important to try before you buy to make sure they fit at all. It'd be a lot like the CX-5 in this regard, but the CX-8's big advantage with its CX-9 wheelbase is that there's a lot more room between the front and rear seats, which in turn leaves decent room for taller adults in the front seat. Now, this is something you can't say for a CX-5 or a lot of other mid-size SUVs. Also like the CX-9, the 40 section of the back seat is on the left-hand side, which helps to minimise disruption when you're climbing into the third row. We haven't needed to use the third row child seats once, but the CX-8's versatility extends to having top tether mounts back here as well in both positions, so you could theoretically have 5 child seats mounted at once. It's a shame you don't get the sturdier ISOFIX child seat mounts back here, but there are proper curtain airbags covering the third row, which is still more than you can say for a lot of 7-seat SUVs and should be considered carefully. Access to the third row from the back doors isn't actually possible with a rearward-facing child seat, but there is a smidge of room with a forward-facing child seat, so skinny kids that don't need strapping in will be able to climb back there. One downside with the Sport is that you don't get the retractable window blinds you do get on the $17,000 dearer CX-8 GT, and nor do you get any window tinting. So we've made do with aftermarket window socks that make your back windows look a bit like a desperate bank robber, but in my experience with kids, it's important to have some sun protection, particularly when they're babies. Something that's not really an issue for us just yet, as my kids are yet to discover devices, but the CX-8 only has 2 USB points. Just 2, that's it. Now, given this is a car designed for 7 people, there's going to be plenty of CX-8 owners that are wanting to charge more than 2 devices at once. If you're clever, you can actually get a 12-volt adapter that has an extra 2 USBs in it. Back on the plus side, it's great that the CX-8 Sport still gets the 3rd climate control zone for the 2nd row, and while little fingers love fiddling with all those little buttons, anything they do can be easily overridden by mum and dad up the front, and therefore keep everybody comfortable. As you'd expect for a Mazda, the overall look and feel up front is generally pretty swish for a car costing just under $40,000. You wouldn't expect leather seat trim in such a big car in this price bracket, but the material the CX-8 Sport does come with is a bit like a polyester suit. It's not a deal breaker though, and as usual, the steering wheel leather and all plastic touch points are top notch. The CX-8 Sport also misses out on electric seat adjustment, which doesn't bother me, but it does make for a relatively flat seat base that, even with the relatively short legs that come with my 172cm height, isn't quite ideal. You get used to it, but it could be better. The CX-8's 8-inch multimedia screen thankfully now comes with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto connectivity, which we cannot recommend strongly enough for any new car purchase, particularly one for families. Families will also appreciate the variety of storage options, with all the usual bins and cup holders close to hand. Now, one detail that's only become apparent after living with the CX-8 Sport for months is that the key fob has clearly been designed for more expensive versions with proximity keys, in that the Sport only has 2 little buttons on it, and while you've got your hands full, you're in a rush, or generally being a parent, it can be quite fiddly to find this lock and unlock button. So does the CX-8 Sport feel more like a CX-5 or a CX-9 to drive? It's certainly more comfortable and a bit less zoom than the CX-5, but I also think it's a smidge more comfortable than the bigger CX-9. This could be due to the fact that the CX-8 is intended as luxury transport in Japan, but it could also be because of the Sport's relatively small 17-inch wheels having a relatively tall tyre sidewall, which makes it easier to absorb bumps. Either way, it doesn't seem to sacrifice stability or agility to achieve this comfort. These wheels may look a bit small and boring, but they work well, and their grey colour is also really handy for keeping them looking clean for ages. The CX-8 Sport Petrol's 2.5 litre petrol engine was always going to be a key element of this test, considering it weighs a fair bit more than the CX-5 with the same engine, but also a fair bit less than the CX-9 with the turbocharged version of this engine, because it also makes its maximum torque a fair bit higher than the CX-9's version. The reality is it's actually quite good, and the only time I've wished for more power was when you go to overtake on a single lane highway. But I don't know about you, but I don't do that very often. Speaking of not very often, I also haven't missed the all-wheel drive, and I've driven the CX-8 on plenty of dirt roads. I might feel differently if I spent a lot of time at the snow, but for general round town and urban use, the two-wheel drive is just fine. One feature I'm really glad the base Sport still gets is the active cruise control, which can make Sydney's network of motorways and their varying levels of congestion much less frustrating, even though traffic's been pretty good of late. The CX-8 Sport also ticks all the important safety boxes, with high speed, low speed and rear auto emergency braking, along with reversing sensors and rear cross traffic alerts. But you'll have to pay nearly $800 extra to add the front parking sensors that come standard on the CX-8 Touring. The CX-8 is still a long car, so sensors can really help use every available inch in those tight parking situations. On the ownership front, Mazda has thankfully joined most other mainstream brands in moving to a decent 5-year warranty, with quite a reasonably priced cap price servicing program to eliminate most variables. Speaking of variables, I was also really interested to see how the fuel consumption fared, given we're pulling a pretty big car with a relatively small engine. Over the 5,000 kilometres we've travelled, we've averaged 9.67 litres per 100 kilometres, which is a fair bit more than the 8.1 litres per 100 official combined figure. As you might expect, this is smack bang between what we experienced with the CX-5 with the same engine and the CX-9 with the turbo version of this engine, and all were achieved using the cheap regular 91 unleaded. So, the CX-8 Sport petrol has been well worth the wait. It is missing some features that would come in handy for family use, but you do have to make some concessions at this price point. It's hard to think of a more accomplished 7-seat family SUV for under $45,000, let alone one $5,000 cheaper again. And don't forget, if you're wanting more details, you can read my full review at the CarsGuide site. And make sure you hit that like button and press subscribe to stay on top of all our latest videos.